management. Kristen earned her PhD from University of California, Davis, where her research focused on human-wildlife conflict, conservation, and conservation planning. Human-wildlife conflict and coexistence have continued to be a priority in her work, which she addressed from an interdisciplinary perspective and using a variety of tools. The tools she used include household survey, camera traps, wildlife GPS collar, GIS, and remote sensing. In 2019, Kristen led creation of research and innovation for the Serengeti ecosystem, RISE, in the Western Serengeti and served as the head scientist until 2024. Under her leadership, RISE implemented long-term ecological research programs investigating elephant movement, fence ecology, and biodiversity monitoring, and a number of training programs, most notably Women in the Field. Kristen currently holds a position as the Chief Scientist in Natural Capital, Research Associate at Colorado State University, Scientific Advisor at the Grumeti Fund, and an advisory board position for the Tanzania Research and Conservation Organization. Without further ado, let me welcome Kristen, who will give a talk titled Conflict, Conservation and Fence, Research Application for the Benefit of People and Wildlife in the Western Serengeti Ecosystem. Welcome all.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to have the chance to kind of share this synthesis of some work with all of you, and hopefully it will spur some good discussion. So I'm just going to dive right into it. To set the scene a little bit, I've spent the last decade working in Tanzania with the Grumeti Fund and RISE, as many of you know. I've had incredible opportunities to collaborate and help build out our long-term applied research programs. Management needs have really defined my research goals and the products that I have worked to contribute to. And there's always a strong desire to have our work and findings feed back into management actions. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share more about some of this longer term work with the broader team at GF and the wider community of those of you who are coming from elsewhere in Tanzania or are perhaps just interested in working in Tanzania. So today I'm going to attempt to synthesize a bit some of the core research programs that I have contributed to over the last 10 years. And I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, you'll have a good understanding of the types of challenges that we've faced in the Western Serengeti, our strategy for implementing research programs to deliver what are hopefully sensible, data-driven approaches to protected area management. I'm going to kind of gloss over some background. I think most of us on this call are very familiar with the Serengeti ecosystem already, but just to make sure we kind of have a level playing field, this ecosystem, the Greater Serengeti ecosystem where we work, it's an enormous transboundary system. So it's over 33,000 square kilometers, extending from northern Tanzania across into Kenya. This system is comprised of a number of protected areas or management blocks with varying legal designations, right? So we have this core area of the national park, which excludes all uses except photographic tourism. And then we have game reserves, which allow permitted hunting and photographic tourism, and then game controlled areas and community conservancies and wildlife management areas, which often allow some additional resource extraction like livestock grazing. The black line in this figure, this map, shows the spatial extent of the infamous wildebeest migration. And so this ecosystem is home to one of the last remaining large-scale migratory systems in the world. This area right here that's highlighted in orange, these blocks that are numbered 1, 2, and 3 are the blocks that we're going to be focusing on today. So block 1, the Grumeti Game Reserve, 2 is the Icona WMA, and 3, Ikorongo Game Reserve. This orangish color, what this indicates, this CPA strong metric, it shows that by metrics of investment in law enforcement, this area of the Western Serengeti is a strongly protected area. And largely over time, this has been driven by high levels of private investment in this area over the past 2 decades. And so this ecosystem, the Serengeti, is characterized by strong environmental gradients, and I want to just highlight rainfall. So this figure in the bottom right shows this strong northwest to southeast gradient of decreasing rainfall, with some of the highest amounts of rain occurring where we work in the Western Corridor. So the Ikarongo-Grumeti concessions are a really important dry season refuge for wildlife. And historically, this area is also better suited climatically for subsistence agriculture and raising livestock in comparison to other areas of northern Tanzania where drought may occur more frequently or more intensely. So in this area, all of us who work here know, right? Subsistence ag is the dominant livelihood, and this area is much more densely settled than other areas in the ecosystem, at least on the Tanzanian side. So this corner of the ecosystem is also characterized by what we call hard boundaries. Farms extend right up to the protected area edge. So in this top right figure of the satellite imagery, you can see the green area to the right side of the black line is Ikarongo Game Reserve, and then you can see all of the farmed parcels outside the protected area that are really densely covering this area. Much of this landscape has been converted. Of course, historically, these protected area boundaries have been permeable, and people and wildlife move back and forth between the protected and unprotected areas. So this proximity between people and wildlife can lead to some very intense interactions. The Ikarongo-Grumeti concessions are a huge conservation success story. So 2 decades ago, this area was rather desolate. The last black rhino had been poached out in the 80s. The migration largely avoided this area, and an initial aerial census in 2002 spotted all of 2 or 3 lions. And over the course of 20 years, with this investment in increased law enforcement, conservation management, investment into communities, this area is now one of the best possible places that you could go to see large and thriving populations of wildlife. So these graphs are just showing this tremendous increase in herbivore biomass demonstrated by buffalo and elephant, and these really increasing observations of carnivores. We also see other research has shown that the wildebeest migration has spent increasing time in this area. So that is shown in this figure by these areas in red are all areas where the wildebeest migration has increased the time that they have spent over the last, I don't remember, maybe 20 years. And this is even more important considering other routes in the historical migration paths have been eliminated. And then, of course, black rhino, have also been reintroduced to this area. So these are all enormous conservation success stories. The flip side of all of this is that you now have these large populations of wildlife that are living in very close proximity and amongst large populations of people. So we see that the recovery of wildlife populations can have these unintended consequences of escalating the severity and frequency of negative interactions between people and wildlife. So we can think of interactions between people and wildlife as existing on a continuum. These interactions can range from negative to positive, minor to severe, and be common or rare. So this range of negative interactions is described as human-wildlife conflict. And in the conservation sector, there's largely an emphasis directed towards reducing these negative interactions. More recently, there's been a shift towards emphasizing opportunities for human-wildlife coexistence. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's an absence of tension, but that the needs of both people and wildlife are balanced and met. So particularly when human livelihoods are at stake, it's important to simultaneously address and minimize conflict while creating opportunities to further coexistence. Conflict between people and wildlife is pretty widely recognized as a primary threat to conservation. When people think that the needs of wildlife are being met or prioritized before their own, it undermines conservation efforts, right? And we see this directly. So people will kill wildlife in retaliation. This is a leading cause of decline for lions, elephants, and other predators globally. But this can also occur indirectly, right? People can vote or support policies or administrations that work against conservation. So right now we're going to dive into some of the research that we have undertaken in the Western Serengeti that has focused on obtaining the information that we need to understand the dynamics of human-wildlife conflict in this system, to identify practical solutions, and then our efforts to really make sure that we're robustly monitoring the impacts of these interventions. So to zoom out a little bit, in Tanzania specifically, addressing human-wildlife conflict is a national priority for sustainable development and wildlife conservation. So it has spurred the creation of a national management strategy, and the primary goal of this strategy is to increase security for those who are living alongside wildlife, with the ultimate goal that it will increase tolerance for wildlife and support for conservation activities. So this bar graph at the bottom of the slide is showing the top 10 districts with reported incidents of conflict by Tawa. And so among those top 2 districts, you see Bunda and Serengeti that are outlined in red, the area in which we work. So this part of the country experiences particularly high rates of reported human-wildlife conflict. So we're going to divide the rest of the talk into 3 parts. First, we're going to look at how we initially assessed and prioritized the problem. Next, how we used that information to identify and implement interventions. And finally, how we're currently working on evaluating the effectiveness of one of these interventions. So to develop an understanding of the context of human-wildlife conflict in the Western Serengeti, we first undertook a spatially systematic and pretty extensive household survey. I want to highlight here the contributions of Benson and Mac, who are the individuals that actually undertook collecting the data for the spatial survey, so the work really wouldn't have been possible without their contributions. And I just want to say, throughout the talk, I'm going to highlight some individuals that were really critical for the work that we've undertaken. I can't highlight everybody, but I want everybody to know that this work that I'm sharing has been the product of a really large number of contributors. All right, so for this household survey, we sampled households in each of these grid cells, and we asked questions about the types of conflict that occurred, species that were responsible, and their people's perceptions of wildlife. So we focused on collecting information on a variety of types of damage across large herbivores and medium and large carnivores. So in agro-pastoralist societies, people are balancing multiple types of risk, right? So most people are farming crops and raising livestock. They're balancing risks from damage to their crops as well as livestock loss across a whole suite of different species. Managers and households have limited resources. So we had a few different goals with this study, but the most relevant to what we're talking about today is we wanted to determine whether there were certain geographic areas that should be prioritized for interventions and what types of damage. So ultimately, I wanted to highlight Brendan and Kate here. They really drove this data analysis. I will call them our Bayesian statistics fundies. But ultimately, the results from this work illustrated that human-elephant conflict was the most geographically widespread form of damage. So these are risk maps of different types of crop damage by baboon, vervet, and elephant, and then the risk of livestock depredation by hyena and lion. So respondents also indicated that crop damage by elephant was the greatest threat to crop production. So comparatively, other threats like low productivity and disease and environmental risk was perceived as greater threats to livestock than damage from predators. So if we apply our results in combination with knowledge from our ongoing monitoring of losses to these axes of the severity and frequency of conflict, we considered crop damage by baboon as relatively rare and minor, damage by elephant as very common and moderate to high severity, damage by lion as the least common but perhaps the most severe, and losses to hyena as common but less so than elephant and moderately severe. So these results really reinforced anecdotal feedback from practitioners. So in combination, we felt confident that the best use of our resources would be to implement strategies that reduce human-elephant conflict. So subsequently, we decided to deploy GPS collars on elephants. We deployed 30 collars, half on bulls, half on cows, to better understand elephant movement in our area and how they were accessing croplands. So our primary goals here were to understand whether there were distinct routes elephants were using to access croplands, what tactics elephants employ to access crops, and later on, how elephants respond to interventions. So with regards to this first goal, where are elephants accessing croplands? Where are they crossing from the protected area into unprotected areas? This did not require any particularly fancy analysis. You can tell even just from this visualization where these orange dots are showing elephant movements outside of the protected area. It was pretty clear that given the extent of the agricultural matrix and the widespread nature of converted land, the really accessible terrain and lack of physical boundaries, elephants are accessing cropland from pretty much any and all points along the protected area boundary. Next, we dove a little bit deeper into understanding the tactics that elephants employ when accessing crops and really trying to characterize our population of elephants in terms of their agricultural usage. So this is work that Nathan undertook as part of his PhD, along with a number of other collaborators like Jake from Inamara and George from Colorado State. And so this figure here, I just want to highlight what I think is the most relevant result for management. And so this figure shows the results of applying these Gaussian mixture models to derive use tactics based on the mean use of agriculture. So there are 4 tactics that are shown here: rare, sporadic, seasonal, and habitual, where rare utilizers of ag are like very infrequent use, and habitual is at the far end of the spectrum with frequent use of ag throughout the year. So the key takeaway here is that unlike other areas or ecosystems where it has mostly been characterized that it's bull elephants that are engaging in crop use, in the Western Serengeti, we found that a large proportion of the monitored elephant population is utilizing agriculture, at least sporadically, and age and sex did not have a significant impact on agricultural use. And so from our assessments, we identified kind of 4 key aspects of our problem. So we know that elephant-induced crop damage is the greatest priority among all stakeholders. There's good alignment on this between local communities, government authorities, and what our research has shown. We understand that crop damage is widespread. Elephants are moving freely in and out of the protected area, and there's no distinct problem animal type. For example, bulls of a certain age. So these characteristics largely eliminate many farm-based traditional deterrents, which are better applied, in more fragmented landscapes where croplands are dispersed or there are clear elephant movement corridors. Like you could choose to implement these farm-based solutions and they would likely be effective for an individual farm. But if our goal is to think a bit bigger and be reducing damage at the landscape level rather than shifting damage from farm to farm, we really need to be implementing landscape level and population-wide approaches. Unfortunately, landscape planning is largely out of contention at this phase due to the level of existing development and conversion. That largely leaves us with implementing some sort of communal physical barrier. So the most effective of which is, when resources are available and the landscape is suitable, electric fencing. So fencing, of course, is a very contentious topic. In recent years, it has received a lot more attention among the scientific community and has spurred the creation of fence ecology as an entire field of dedicated research. So there are lots of really strong opinions regarding its use in conservation. For me, I think a very sensible approach is that fencing is a tool and it has useful and beneficial applications, but it's not suitable everywhere or even most places, and it requires really good due diligence and a commitment to monitoring its impacts. So this map shows, this paper is a little bit old now. It was published back in 2019, but it showed at that time the spatial distribution of fenced, partially fenced, and unfenced reserves across the continent. And Tanzania has historically been a bit of an anomaly in East and Southern Africa because, prior to what we're going to talk about today, there were no fenced or partially fenced protected areas in the country at all. So fencing was not an approved protected area management tool. However, I'm not going to get into the background on this, but for various reasons, the Tanzanian government was interested in a trial of electric fencing. And we were given permission to erect a trial fence after a really significant due diligence process along Ikorongo Game Reserve. So one of the purposes of this fence was to mitigate human-elephant conflict. There's a much more extensive background also in terms of black rhino management, which we'll not dive into. But for our purpose today, just to give a bit of background on the process that went into identifying not just whether a fence was suitable, but if a fence was to be constructed, what should that look like? This process consisted of reviewing literature, conversations and site visits with other protected areas where fencing had been used successfully and not, to understand the requirements, potential pitfalls, and design options. So there are a ton of different ways that you can construct a fence. If you're going to build a fence fit for purpose, you really need to be designing that fence for your target species. So we use the elephant movement data and historical wildebeest movement data to ensure that we wouldn't be cutting off movement corridors. And then we costed out construction and recurring maintenance costs, conducted stakeholder meetings, and formally pursued and received government approvals. On site, this also involved setting up systems to make sure that we could track sources of fence damage, maintenance activities, and wildlife mortalities. So we set up a system of reports that could be called in via radio by field teams that were monitoring the fence and then integrated with existing operations room and field team procedures. So the fence itself is a 30-kilometer long electric fence along the Ikorongo Game Reserve boundary from Mbirikiri in the north to Park Ngoti in the south. That's that purple line in the map on the left. So this area is characterized by a particularly hard boundary where there is a lot of community support for fencing, and where we felt confident that it was ecologically suitable. So given that this fencing project is a pilot project, these endpoints of the fence are completely arbitrary. The fence just ends. Ideally, you would pair a fence with some form of natural barrier or paired mitigation. So this design, which is a bit hard to see in this photo on the right, but it's called an elephant short fence. It's modeled after the first elephant short fence that was used in Lewa in Kenya, and it's specifically designed for elephants, although it also prevents the movement of larger game like rhino, giraffe, hippo, and buffalo. It's essentially a 2-foot-tall, 3-strand electrified fence with these 4-foot-long electrified outriggers that extend from the top wire into the protected area, and they're angled at 45 degrees. So these electrified outriggers are really what prevents elephants from accessing these unelectrified wooden poles and pushing the fence over. So as a nationwide pilot of electric fencing for conservation, this has real implications for conservation policy in the country, and so our monitoring and evaluation program needs to reflect that. I'm going to discuss just an evaluation of the fence as a human-elephant conflict prevention tool. This is part of a much bigger and broader study investigating the social and ecological impacts and efficacy of the Ikorongo fence, which, if you attended a previous talk from Michael Kimaro, you would have heard much more about that monitoring and research effort as part of his PhD. So I'm going to focus on just these 3 elements. First, can we detect changes in elephant movement behavior in response to the fence? So elephant movement behavior at the boundary specifically. Does the fence prevent elephant access into adjacent farms? And do we observe a shift in agricultural use towards these fence endpoints? Because that is kind of a point that people bring up whenever you talk about fencing is, are you just shifting the damage to where this fence ends? Which is a really valid question. So qualitatively, it's pretty obvious from these maps that there's a marked difference in elephant movement behavior at the boundary pre and post fencing. So these maps show in orange, these little dots are each individual fixes of elephant movement outside the protected area, pre and post fence construction divided by bulls and cows. And you can see that thin little red line that I probably should have made a bit thicker is that Ikorongo fence. And so qualitatively, again, pretty obvious that there's a difference pre and post fence construction of how elephants are utilizing the area outside the protected area along the Ikorongo Game Reserve boundary, but we want to understand to what degree elephant access to farms was prevented and if there are any areas of vulnerability. And, given that elephants are notoriously divergent in their behaviors, they're true individuals, how consistent was this response across individuals? So just to mention a bit about the data analysis, we divided the elephant movement data into a pre-fencing period that was March 2018 to October 2019, and then March 2020 to March 2022. We excluded this construction time frame between November of 2019 and March of 2020. So first, we evaluated changes in elephant movement behavior in response to the fence. So this work was completed with Lois Majije, who this work was part of her master's at Glasgow University. And we used an approach here called barrier behavior analysis. Basically, you're identifying instances using telemetry data where an animal encounters a boundary. And then you're classifying that movement behavior based on the duration of the encounter and whether that barrier is crossed. So the primary behavioral categories resulting from this analysis are shown here. There's quick cross behavior where the animal approaches a boundary and then just quickly maneuvers across it. There is average movement, which is just kind of like typical movement behavior around the barrier. There is bounce, where an animal is approaching that barrier and then redirecting their movement away. Back and forth, where they're tracing movement along that barrier. I guess I shouldn't call that trace, but back and forth, but it's movement changing direction. Trace is actually they're following along that barrier in a single continuous direction. And then trapped, where an animal becomes engaged for like longer duration behavioral encounters and is not able to effectively navigate away from that boundary. And so if I can get this to show, for this analysis, we excluded animals that did not encounter the boundary during both phases. So this included an analysis of 16 individuals, 6 cows, and 10 bulls. And these figures show the proportion of encounters by behavior, pre-fencing on the top, post-fencing on the bottom, and then in both dry and wet seasons. So I want us to really just focus on the light blue and light tan figures in this box plot. So this light blue are quick cross, the proportion of quick cross behavioral events, whereas the tan is bounce behavior. So the most important finding here is with regards to these two behavioral types. When we compare behavior pre and post fencing, we see that quick cross behavior shown in this light blue is the most common behavior pre-fencing. Post-fencing, these quick crosses drop considerably. They no longer dominate these encounter events. Instead, bounce behavior becomes the most prevalent. I haven't shown results here distributed by sex as well, but I want you to know that this change is consistent across sexes, individuals, and seasons. So given the notable individual variability in behavior in elephants, this consistent finding is really important and really kind of amazing. So here, I want to dive a bit deeper into these quick cross events. So this map is showing in light blue. These are these quick cross events prior to fence construction, and you see that these at the boundary, elephants are just quickly crossing back and forth between the protected area and community land across the entire length of the boundary. This figure that's labeled C is just showing the density of these quick cross events along the length of the boundary, and they're pretty widely distributed. When we look at the distribution of these events post-fence construction, what we see is that the density of these quick cross events are actually concentrated very close to the fence endpoints. And that makes sense, right? As I mentioned before, these fence endpoints are arbitrary. They just end. Elephants can easily circumnavigate these endpoints. So in a lot of cases, these quick cross events are not actually physical breaches of the fence, but it's just elephants moving around these endpoints. We also examined the output from this BABA analysis. They produce these cool little figures that actually show you each encounter event, the trajectory of the animal that's shown in black and blue in relation to the barrier, which is shown in red. So you can actually investigate these individual encounter events and look at the trajectory. And so we manually examined each of the quick cross events just to see, were elephants actually physically breaching the fence outside of these cases where it's clear that elephants are circumnavigating these fence endpoints. And what we did see is that the majority of cases were actually these, what I would call like geometry or accuracy errors. So this left pane is showing an example of what I would call a geometry error, where this trajectory is really, you have these individual GPS fixes, right, of the elephant's location. And then a trajectory is drawn between these points in a straight line. And so this event on the left, you can see that all three of these fixes are actually inside the protected area on this right side of the red line. But when the trajectory is drawn between these points in a straight line, it bisects the fence, it bisects the barrier. So that triggers it to be classified as a quick cross event, even though we know in this case, this elephant likely was staying inside the protected area. And then an example of an accuracy error in the pane on the right. GPS collars have something of an accuracy depending on how long the fix is. Your fix settings is somewhere between like 10 and 20 meters. And so we did also see some cases where from the trajectory, it seemed pretty clear that the elephant had stayed within the protected area, in this case on the left side of the barrier. But there's maybe like the fix was like a couple meters past the fence path. And so that is going to also trigger classification of a quick cross event. So in combination with fence monitoring data and manual examination of each quick cross event, we feel pretty confident that these quick cross events in the post-fence phase are like one of three things. It's either circumnavigation of these fence endpoints, geometry or accuracy errors, or rare cases where elephants outside the protected area are actually breaking through the fence to enter back into the protected area. Again, remember those electrified outriggers are just facing into the protected area. So actually in terms of breaking the fence from the other direction, that's quite easy to do. Okay, so now considering the next two questions, does the fence prevent elephant access to farms adjacent to the fence? And do we observe a shift in agricultural use towards fence endpoints? So to accomplish this, we calculated the point density of elephant GPS fixes in buffered distance that extended from 200 to 5,000 meters from the fence path at 200-meter intervals, both inside and outside the protected area. So this is going to give us some insights into how utilization changed at varying distances of the boundary, both inside and outside the protected area. So we did consider core and end segments of the fence separately for two reasons. First, so we could examine actually how use changed near the fence endpoints. And secondly, because elephants could, of course, access these areas by circumventing the fence endpoints rather than directly breaching it. So the end segments of the fence were 5 kilometers each. So that's these segments that are highlighted in blue. And then the core middle segment of the fence was 20 kilometers long. We decided on this end segment distance of 5 Ks because that's equal to the mean daily displacement of elephants in our data set. So it's essentially how far an elephant might walk in a day. We completed this analysis using matched temporal windows in pre and post phases for each individual animal. And then we applied a 6-month minimum of data in each phase. And so that left us with a data set of 27 individuals. All right, so this figure shows fixed density by buffer distance. So distance is on the x-axis and then fixed density on the y. And then this is broken down by inside the protected area as shown in black, outside the protected area in red. The core fence are these solid lines, and then the end segments are the dashed lines. So if we kind of break this apart line by line, this solid red line at the bottom of the figures shows that elephant land use or elephant utilization of village lands adjacent to the core segment of the fence dropped to 0 post-fence construction. This dashed red line is use in village areas adjacent to the fence endpoints. Here you can see that use was higher than adjacent to the core section in both fence phases, but in the post-fence phase, utilization near these fence endpoints was actually lower than prior to fence construction. So we don't have any evidence that elephants shifted increased utilization of village lands towards these more accessible fence endpoints. Interestingly, we also see an increased use of habitat inside the protected area along the core section of the fence. So that's this this black solid line. And so we think that this is likely because livestock use and human disturbance was pretty high here prior to fence construction. And with the fence, we know from our other research that cattle particularly have been excluded from accessing the protected area. And so perhaps this is some initial evidence that the fence extended actually the effective size of the protected area to more truly reflect its actual boundaries. So one caveat that I do want to mention is that environmental conditions have been relatively good in comparison to long-term averages during this post-fencing period that we presented here. So this dashed line shows, like a 23-year historical average of NDVI, which is a common indicator of environmental conditions. And this solid black line shows the actual conditions during our study period. So in this post-fencing phase where this black line, the solid line is higher than the dashed line, it showed that those actual conditions were exceeding historical averages. So I do think we need a better understanding of, what happens when environmental conditions are poor and elephants may experience greater pressure to exit the protected area. And similarly, we might also experience increased damage or vandalization to the fence if there's more pressure on people to get like livestock access to better grazing. Linking way back to that household survey that we conducted in 2017, some of you may have seen some of these results if you attended Michael's previous talk. But as part of his PhD work, Michael has focused on evaluating the social and ecological impacts of this fence, and he repeated this household survey on wildlife damage that we had previously completed. And he also extended it even a bit northward along the Serengeti National Park boundary. So he's still working on data analysis, but this map shows that the raw results of the presence, which are these red blocks, and then the absence in green of elephant-induced crop damage in, I think, 2023. And these raw data results do show a similar story, that this core area of the fence is well protected from elephants, whereas, crop damage by elephants has persisted in these other unfenced boundary areas. And then I also did not share any of this work here, but many of you know we also have a long-term camera trapping grid across the concession. So in 2017, we deployed hundreds of cameras inside the protected area to monitor wildlife. And this project has required, the support and dedication of a huge number of people. And so I see some of you on this call, largely in support from, the Grumeti Fund section managers, as well as the research and monitoring department, and many, many interns at RISE who have spent tons of time classifying data, keeping these cameras deployed in the field, downloading data, classifying it. It's a huge job. And sometimes with really big efforts like this, it can feel a bit like, what are we doing all of this for? And I just want to highlight here the real utility of long-term data sets like this. When we deployed this project, we didn't know that there would be a fence constructed. We had certain research objectives in mind, but having this permanent record of wildlife presence and absence between 2017 and 2024 lets you do some really cool things that you don't even maybe envision at the start of the project. And I would say that, the most important use of this data to date has been Michael's use of this data to investigate how fence presence has influenced wildlife presence and activity patterns. So the camera trap locations are shown here in this map on the right, these little dots within Ikorongo Game Reserve. So here it's just highlighting the camera locations that he used in his work. Roughly 100 cameras deployed across Ikorongo. And in general, Michael found that the fence had no significant effect on large mammal abundance. So distance, fencing stage, and season did not interact significantly. However, results for wildebeest were an exception. We did see a slight increase in capture rates near the Ikorongo Game Reserve boundary in the wet season during the post-fencing stage. And because nothing is ever simple or neatly wrapped up, he did also find a significant interaction between animal diversity and distance from the reserve boundary, as well as the fencing stage. So here, showing two results, the Shannon Diversity Index and then the Simpson Index on the right, which are both different measures for species diversity. And then you see in the red lines are showing post-fencing and the blue are showing pre-fencing, these diversity indices. And we do see with both of these metrics that there is a decline in species diversity post-fencing in closer proximity to the fence path. In contrast, animal diversity was relatively stable at all distances during the pre-fence stage. So this could suggest that the fence contributed to a reduction in animal diversity near the reserve boundary, but these results are super preliminary. We do need to dive a bit deeper into these metrics because they do also include a measure of evenness, and given the sheer numbers of wildebeest herds and their increased use of this area by wildebeest following fence construction, that might contribute to a greater dominance of a single species, although we have now also looked at these results just with resident wildlife and excluding migratory wildlife, and the results seem to hold. But we need to dive a bit deeper to kind of understand the mechanism here. Okay. And just to give an idea of the broader scope of this project, a reminder that I've shared, one piece of this project in the fence monitoring effort as it relates to human-elephant conflict. So there's a large range of other work that has been completed or is in the process of being completed and analyzed. So from a human-wildlife conflict perspective, the impact of this fence is really powerful and quite clear, but it isn't the only element that we have to take into account. So a few key takeaways here. Fences that are carefully designed, they're well maintained and sufficiently budgeted, can be highly efficacious tools for reducing crop damage by elephants. We, at this point, have not observed elephants shift crop use to fence endpoints. Whether elephants are actually reducing their overall use of agriculture at like a landscape level is not yet clear. And then I think from this project, we've also derived some essential requirements for fencing to really be on the table as a management tool. So first, the fence obviously has to be constructed in an ecologically suitable location. This is most suitable for hard boundaries, and the design should be specific to target your species of priority and minimizing impact on non-target species. Stakeholder support is essential. Theft and vandalism can completely undermine a fence and make it a complete wasted effort and a huge financial loss. Financial resources. So areas where fences have had the biggest negative effects have been those where fences have not been maintained. So it's not just the fence construction costs that have to be considered, but also this maintenance in perpetuity. And then I do think that there's a responsibility to monitor impacts on wildlife and to evaluate whether you're having the intended impact, whether there are unintended consequences, and at what scale. All right, that is all I have. There are a large number of people and organizations to thank, some of whom are listed here. But thanks so much for your time today and for listening. And yeah, George, you can maybe let me know how you'd like to go about taking questions.
Thank you very much, Kristen, for such an amazing presentation. You definitely had a lot of information which you're processing. But thank you very much again for our online participants. So for Q&A session, we will, you can just raise your hand and then I will allow you, or you can type your question and then we can, Kristen can have access to the question directly. But just feel free, you can just raise your hand and then unmute yourself and ask the question. I hope I will see everyone here. Do you have any question for those who are in person? No? All right, maybe I'll block that. So, Kristen, there has been an increase in lion predation or like attacking livestock, especially around the grazing area in Makunduchi. And I know you looked at human wildlife conflict in general during your study. So I was just wondering whether you have some information of the trend for the lions attacking livestock, or like because it's really becoming a problem. Just like within 3 months, there have been like 16 livestock killed by lion, and also I think there was like 2 human mortality and some people are injured. I was just wondering if you have any kind of data like from your study, which may indicate what's going on.
Yeah, again, I think the most relevant results that still hold at this time are from that household survey we did. Again, that was in 2017, so it's quite old at this point. But I think that the findings, the core takeaways are still relevant in that livestock depredation is like much more geographically isolated, and there are like very clear areas of vulnerability, like that one that you mentioned around Makunduchi grazing area. So I think on the downside, livestock depredation is like quite high cost, right, to individual households. Those are really severe losses in terms of the financial impact and kind of the cultural value that livestock hold. I think on the positive side, the geographic or spatial restriction of livestock losses to lion does mean that it could be managed pretty effectively with localized interventions. And I think that there's a combination of approaches that could be suitable. So that could be, implementing things like living BOMAs, like Tanzanian People and Wildlife has shown to be really effective elsewhere, or just like more robust BOMAs in general, which there are like multiple designs that have been illustrated to be really effective for livestock loss. The challenge usually comes with how to, like, who should pay for those and how to share those costs, because they can be expensive to implement. And then I do think that there are some husbandry practices that can be implemented that result in kind of avoiding spatial overlap between livestock and predators by season. So that means like managing what water resources you're using. Challenges with that in a highly converted landscape are definitely present, but I do think that there's opportunity to explore there as well.
Thank you very much. Have any other question from the room? Francesca, I don't know whether it's Francesca, can unmute yourself in that. We can.
Sorry, I think you're on mute.
For your voices.
Oh, you muted.
No. We still can't hear.
It might be the headphones, or maybe you can type if that works for you.
Let me just.
Oh, he can hear you now.
Yeah, it's coming through.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay, no idea what's going on with those headphones. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Kristen. That was really, really impressive presentation, and fantastic to see just the depth of the research that's been completed. I was wondering where this originated from, being a pilot fence, if obviously the body of research has been shared back to the government and to the relevant stakeholders, and whether there's been a review of obviously how effective it is, but as a pilot, was there ever a proposal to extend it, or to do more with it after this evaluation period?
Yeah, so I'm actually probably not the most up to date on these discussions right now. There have been proposals to extend the fence to the area that GF in particular is involved in managing. So there have been communities that have indicated that they also want a fence to manage human-wildlife conflict. I think for Ikarongo, that's like a very straightforward area to fence with that like hard boundary, clear community support. There have been some discussions of extending the fence to the southwest, like where the wildlife management area is, and along Grumeti Game Reserve. I think those areas are inherently more complex in terms of figuring out like where would it be suitable for a fence to go that simultaneously manages the needs of people and wildlife and livestock having access to communal resources, and balancing that with also like wanting to prevent damage to the fence. So yeah, there have been discussions for years. Whether another phase will come to fruition, whether that will be deemed most suitable, I think that remains to be determined.
Okay, thank you. No, that's really interesting. And just a very quick follow-up question. As you're saying that the initial surveys with community households was in 2017. Are there ongoing, is there ongoing data collection on HEC events and feedback from the communities, particularly at those endpoints of the fence?
Yeah, so Michael repeated that same household survey in 2023, which was that figure. I think I can pull that up here. So he repeated that same household survey. And then we do have like more continuous ongoing monitoring data from select villages where we work with village agricultural officers to record instances. And then the operations room also receives human-wildlife conflict alerts and reports from, well, human-wildlife conflict alerts, there's a toll-free hotline that any community member in these villages can call into. So we have records of that, as well as follow-up reports from the mitigation unit that responds to these events as well. And yeah, I would say like all of these sources like pretty much illustrate there are multiple, I guess, sources of information that tell the same story in terms of the spatial distribution of human-elephant conflict pre and post-fence construction, which does make us feel like we have pretty good confidence in our understanding of the impact of this fence on human-elephant conflict.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, I just wanted to add like a quick update on what has been going on ground. Last week, there was a committee that was formed by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism. They spent like a week within the Serengeti district to get some opinions from the communities and also from all the stakeholders around the area. So we believe that will be a good progress on the second phase of the fence, and the community seems to be happy. The main question is just like, where should the fence pass? Because we have pastoralists who want some access, water, and also pasture land. And that's kind of like, but they are all happy. They really want the fence to be erected. So now I welcome Patrick Chisale to ask his question, and then followed by Dr. Stephen Ten. Patrick?
Thank you so much for giving me this time to ask a question. First of all, I have to say thank you for the good presentation for the human-wildlife conflict, which is being assisted by Kristen. My question is, of course, I joined later due to the network problem, but I don't know if you tackled it already, because I just want to know about you talked about the community engagement and other stakeholders. My question is straight to the communities, because they are the ones who vandalize the face, and I don't know which the mechanism did the government put in place for this problem. In addition to that, I saw some in the program that you are going to talk about the biological control, like maybe growing some other crops which cannot be eaten by these elephants, like the chili and the other products. So I don't know on that, if you had time to go through on that. That's what I just want to know by now, even though I joined late.
Okay, I will try to remember each aspect of your question. You can let me know if I have left anything out. In terms of the stakeholder engagement, I'm not sure, George, is David around or no?
Not today.
No, okay.
And
yeah, so we do have
a representative of his unit.
Sorry?
We have a representative from Human-Wildlife Conflict.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I can't personally speak too much in terms of what went into like the individual aspects of stakeholder engagement prior to fence construction. There is like an entire relationships team at Grumeti that engages in activities like that, but I can give you kind of at least one anecdote that I think illustrates the level of community support in these villages adjacent to Ikorongo for the fence. I think towards the end, I mentioned how easy it is to undermine fencing if there's not community support. Theft, vandalism, fences are easily destroyed. And I believe when this fence was originally constructed, there was, one or two instances of vandalism where people stole like solar panels. Their neighbors immediately reported it. And since then, very, very low rates of vandalism to this fence. Like people want this fence to be maintained. They see the value in terms of it protecting their farms. And so I think whereas other areas, there have been big news stories elsewhere during like periods of drought where huge extents of fencing have been removed when there's not community support for it. That has not been the experience here. So I think in general, there's been a lot of community support for the fence. In terms of the other maybe options for managing human-elephant conflict, like you mentioned, planting other crops that are less palatable, like chili or sunflower. I do think that those are, options, and they definitely have a place in managing human-elephant conflict. I think it depends on the scale at which you perhaps are looking to manage conflict incidents. So I think that that is very much at an individual household level, a decision that you can make. Perhaps like programs tailored towards supporting farming more novel crops like that are particularly well suited for landscapes where farms are more fragmented, or there are distinct corridors of elephant movement that they're using to access farms. I think in terms of the scale at which we would have to look in our area to plant crops, less palatable crops, to have an impact on reducing human-elephant conflict, I'm not sure that that is the best approach here. But I do agree that in other areas, that has demonstrable value.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I could just quickly add on the point about support. My name is Noel. I'm Bise from Grumeti Fund. So, like Kristen said, for phase 1, there's been demonstrable support to the fence, because I believe of the relief that it has resulted into. We had a local stakeholders workshop in a nearby town recently, like 5 days ago, actually. And it was almost unanimously supported by the villager leadership that was represented. And maybe if I can just also point out that that seminar was for providing or disseminating results from this research to the local community members and other players in the local area. And when the fence, because I think Chisale's question had a point about government, he did mention government. When the fence was also being constructed back in 2019, the government was very clear that it should be systematically assessed, being relatively a new tool in Tanzania at that scale, that it should be assessed, and that's what Michael's research is mostly focused on. So I think even if there could be challenges in the beginning, when people see the results, I think that level of support increases, but it is important to be monitoring this, because otherwise we may not know what is influencing what without such detailed data. Thank you.
Thanks all for that additional information. Dr. Stephen Thames?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lohai, and thank you, Madam Kristen, for your wonderful presentation. Perhaps I missed some point, but I just want to ask, based on the type of the intervention, this kind of electric fence to mitigate the human-wildlife conflict, specifically elephant, is this a first kind of approach or study of its kind in Tanzania or Africa, or are there any similar interventions that are being implemented or have been implemented in the country or outside? And perhaps what are the lessons that can be learned from those kind of similar approaches? And maybe the last one, you mentioned about wildlife mortalities, about the potential impact of the fence, but I did not catch that one. Perhaps you tell us if there any kind of, perhaps you observed any wildlife mortalities resulting from the presence of the electric fence? Thank you.
Sure. The work on wildlife mortalities is part of the broader scope of the project. So here today, I was just talking about fencing as a human-elephant conflict management tool, so didn't include that kind of information, but we have monitored wildlife mortalities along the fence line. Mortality events have occurred, although, yeah, I guess when you compare it to other sources of mortality in general that occur, relatively minor, I will say, in that scale, but there have been cases of animals, like when the migration comes through, folks have used the fence as a hunting tool. So like driving animals to the fence and using it as an opportunity to hunt wildebeest. There have not been any like large scale mortality events from the wildebeest like hitting the fence or something. A cool aspect of the fence design is that the fence posts actually are have like these metal stakes on the bottom, that so if the fence is hit very hard, like by an animal that is running at speed, like a herd of wildebeest, that the fence will just, that segment of fence has like some flexibility, some bounce where it can collapse or, you know, not lead to these mass mortality events like have occurred in other places. But yeah, there have been a few examples of entanglement and electrocution, and then a few examples of people using the fence as a hunting tool. I think that is certainly a priority for management going forward. I think our most common observations of that were in the first year or two of fence construction, and that has become less of a management issue over time. But Noel, feel free to correct me if that is inaccurate with more recent information. But yeah, I think that Michael has also presented on these results, so you can also access his recorded talk from George if you want to learn more about the ecological impacts of the fence. I also shared towards the end of the talk, I think, what are several important lessons that we have learned. Within Tanzania, this is certainly the first example of an electric fence as a protected area management tool and a comprehensive assessment of its impact. So I do think that, you know, these key takeaways, if there will be an interest in, or there is an interest in scoping out what could fencing look like as a protected area management tool and what does fencing policy look like in Tanzania, I do think that there are very important takeaways and considerations and minimum criteria that should be met for fencing in terms of the ecological suitability, stakeholder support, financial resources, and commitment to monitoring. But yeah, I don't think I'm going to go through and anyway. I don't know how much more detail you'd like me to go into, but I do think that that is a good point, that we do have to take lessons learned and share them more broadly and kind of determine, you know, if fencing is a potential protected area management tool in Tanzania, what are these requirements? Where is fencing potentially suitable? What thresholds have to be met? What areas is it not a suitable tool and should never be considered? I think are critical questions to ask.
For the sake of time, I think I will allow two more questions. First one from Owen Oliver. If you can just ask your question and then followed by Gladys, Lendy, and then Kristen can answer them together. Because I see we are almost 10 minutes past the time, but I really appreciate your time and your patience. So Owen, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question was about mortality, but it's already answered. So my next question is, what was the placement distance of all the cameras that were placed? But also, I would like to know about when we are assessing the agricultural utilization on the adjacent, the ends points of the fences. What was the consideration distance? You said 2,000 to 500 meters. Why was that?
Okay, so first for the cameras, our cameras are set up in a typical monitoring grid where each grid cell is 5 square kilometers, and it was extending over all of Ikorongo Game Reserve. Unfortunately, due to like high levels of human impact, within like 500 meters of the boundary. We did have higher levels of theft of cameras that were like immediately adjacent to the boundary. So we do kind of lack some data from like that immediate protected area boundary edge. And then in terms of, so looking at utilization near the fence endpoints, so we basically wanted to look at utilization at varying distance from the fence, right? So at the distance, we picked continuous distances of 200 to 5,000 meters. And then each buffer distance was sequential in like 200-meter intervals. So we just selected those intervals to give us a clear picture of what was happening at varying distances from the fence. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying, but because you were looking at the crop utilization, how did the elephant impact the crops adjacent to the fence? Did they enter the farms, and how frequent was the raids of the crops in those kind of farms? Was they severe due to that the adjacent places where there were no incidences, right? So were the impacts on the adjacent farms near the end of the fence highly severe due to that? The only places that they could feed upon was those places. Was it muchly severe, or was it still in a low reductant number than other places when pre-mitigation?
Right. So I understand what you're saying now. So unfortunately, from movement data, we wouldn't have insight into like the severity of crop losses. So here, we've just looked at how extensively elephants utilized village land outside the protected area pre and post fencing. So this is just giving us an idea of how much time was spent in community land adjacent to the fence endpoint. It wouldn't give us insights into the severity of damage, which I think is a valid point, but would require a different mode of inquiry to get at that information. But yeah, I think that is a good idea. And maybe we can look into our other sources of human-elephant conflict records, like from agricultural officers to get a better sense of that.
Okay, our last question will be from Gladys.
Okay, hello, hi, thank you very much. Thank you, Kristen, for your very informative information regarding the wildlife conflicts with the communities around Serengeti National Park. Have seen that you have already progressed with the development of the fences that could help to reduce the conflicts. But I wonder, or I wish to have the information if at all before you have you had other integrated methods such as those approaches that can be used concurrently, like developing the chill fence or chill blocks, or having the firecrackers join teams, spotlights, and other biological measures that together have succeeded or have not succeeded, to what extent, until we come up with the idea of having the developing of the fences.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, there were some tools that were implemented before the fence, some of which were implemented by management, some which were community-led initiatives. So, you know, from the community side, and I think they worked with FZS, there are these community task forces that had, that coordinated kind of like lookout towers to see when elephants were approaching communities and then to deter them, which I think is one very cool and important example of a community-led initiative that had some success. And then from a management perspective, yeah, so there were human wildlife conflict management units, which are like dedicated teams to respond to calls from community members on conflict incidents, which we had looked at before that did have, you know, moderate levels of success. So I think when responding to incidents in terms of trying to remove, like locally remove or return animals to the reserve, is maybe effective like 60 to 70% of the time in doing that. So I think that is a valuable approach. I think certainly in terms of building like relationship building with communities and showing your investment in responding to incidents is invaluable in that regard. I believe that there had been previous efforts also to look at beehive fencing along the stretch of Ikorongo Game Reserve. And when we did an initial assessment, it was determined like just not to be the best area for a continuous like linear beehive fence along the boundary because of environmental constraints around water and flowering plants. Yeah, so I do think that there is a long history of trying to use various approaches to manage human-elephant conflict in this landscape. I think the challenge here is that human-elephant conflict was so widespread, it was so severe, it was very difficult to identify specific focal areas for intervention when the conflict was so widespread that it kind of felt like a bigger landscape level tool was needed, which is how fencing was kind of arrived at as being like a locally suitable tool in this case.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much again to our online participants and for those who came in person, to our anti-poaching unit, which has also joined online. We want to thank Kristen for a very nice presentation. A hand of applause, please. We are particularly grateful because Kristen was head scientist here at RISE, and she has mentored a number of graduate students, including Lolian and Yasatu, who are right here now. So it's quite a great pleasure to have you here to give a talk on your research at Grumeti. We are very happy, and also you are still part of our team, but we are really grateful. So thank you very much for setting time aside. I know it's still early in the morning there. Asante sana, and for our online participants, thank you very much for joining, and we will be sharing upcoming seminars for those who have opted to receive emails from us. So thank you very much again. Until next time.
Well, thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you for having me and your attention and your great questions. And yeah, maybe next time it can be in person. Let's hope.
All right. Thank you very much. And I've just sent Kristen's email for those who want to ask more serious questions. Please feel free to send email to Kristen.
Cool.
All right.
Bye. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Nimeshawaambia. Nimepata.